English backpacker Paul was hitchhiking down a road in New South Wales, Australia, recently leaving a youth hostel. He was leaving Sydney and was hoping to make it to Mildura, a suburb located interstate in northwest Victoria. Walking down the Hume Highway, Paul entered the beginning of the Belangolo State Forest, a massive array of trees, bush, and wildlife covering roughly 3,800 hectares. A Toyota Land Cruiser slowly approached and eventually stopped. Paul approached the passenger side door and saw a man. The man asked if he needed a lift. When Paul informed the man of his plans, the man said Paul could hop in. Paul was ecstatic. One of the first people he met on the first leg of his journey, and he had struck gold. He was knocking out a big part of his journey early on. But as time went on, Paul started to notice some red flags. The driver of the car, who introduced himself as Ivan, began making some unsettling comments. He started saying offensive things about the immigrants of Australia and was going off on some passionate rants. Paul started to wonder if maybe he had made a mistake getting into the car. Not long later, Ivan said that they've lost the radio signal, so he's gonna pull over and get some cassette tapes from under the driver's side seat so that they can listen to some music. This was another red flag for Paul. He noticed earlier in the trip that there were a number of cassette tapes in the console between them, so why isn't he just putting one of those on? Paul was conflicted. His head was telling him something was off. He decided to test Ivan to see how he'd react. He got out of the car and briefly walked away. Immediately, Ivan seemed concerned and asked what he was doing. Paul just said he was stretching his legs. Paul thought to himself, they were on the Hume Highway, a long but busy stretch of road. There was plenty of traffic around. If something bad was going to happen, it surely wouldn't happen here. He got back in the car. Ivan was watching him this whole time and jumped back in when he did. Then, seconds later, he said he's just going to take another look under the seat for the tapes one more time. He again put his hands under the seat, but this time he quickly pulled out a revolver and pointed it at Paul. He said this is a robbery. Suddenly all of Ivan's questionable actions made sense. Ivan then pulled out some rope and showed it to Paul. As much as the gun freaked him out, the rope really concerned Paul. Ivan must be planning to keep him for some time. Paul's instinct kicked in and he decided to run for it. He jumped out of the car and bolted up the Hume Highway. Ivan screamed at Paul, "Stop or I'll shoot." Paul kept running when suddenly he started hearing gunshots. Ivan was shooting at him. Paul was trying to wave down cars to stop and help him, but the drivers of the car could see what was happening. They dodged Paul and drove on. Paul was struggling to stop a car as Ivan was shooting at him. Desperate, Paul made a decision that he was going to stop the next car that came past, no matter what, even if they hit him. A van came past, and Paul stood in front of them and did not move out of the way. The van stopped. Paul threw himself inside the van and screamed, "Help me, he's got a gun." The driver quickly turned around and drove the other way. As they drove away, Paul decided to have a quick glance back at the scene. Ivan was still standing on the road, gun in hand, watching the car drive away. Paul noticed something that stuck with him. Ivan had a big smirk on his face. Unfortunately, amid all the panic, nobody got the number plate of Ivan's car, but Paul did tell his story to the local police officer. Unfortunately, no further action was taken after Paul gave his statement. Paul later returned to England. News came about that 2 British backpackers were found murdered in Belangolo State Forest in New South Wales, Sydney. When Paul saw this in the newspaper, it confirmed the suspicions he had all along. The man never intended to rob him, but had much darker, sinister intentions. Paul would later speak to Australian authorities and was flown to Australia to give a statement. Paul remained paranoid about this whole situation. Ivan had his passport, address, and backpack as he left them in his car, so Ivan would know all about him. Was Paul being led into a trap to ensure he was kept silent? Fortunately, this wasn't the case, and Paul's information would eventually prove pivotal in catching the man who was responsible for 7 innocent people losing their lives in Belangolo State Forest between 1989 and 1993. His MO would be to pick up hitchhikers along the Hume Highway, taking them into the forest, and commit unspeakable acts. Ivan Milat would be sentenced to 7 life sentences and would die in prison on the 27th of October 2019. Paul was offered a $200,000 reward for his statement that led to the capture of Ivan, but he declined, citing it as hollow money that would never bring him joy. His reward was life.